some inspirational figures throughout history and some interesting words that seem quite relevant to us who've been following ICANN and the new gTLD program for a while, waiting, watching, dreaming. So I felt that was a little bit relevant for us. Anyway, I think that's all I have. Thank you to ISOC and to David, and I'm going to turn it over now to Mike Nelson, who will be presenting our moderator. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Mike Nelson. I've been involved in resurrecting the DC chapter of the Internet Society, and David Viorst, who's one of our co-conveners for the chapter, has asked me just to say a few reasons of why every single one of you should be actively involved in the Internet Society chapter here in town. First off, how many people here are already actively involved in the chapter? Okay, so all of you who aren't raising your hand, go talk to those people. We do at least one event like this every month. We try to do a happy hour, and we have one of those coming up.
Actually, a big holiday party on Thursday.
Holiday party on Thursday at the Science Club, right?
No.
Oh, no?
No, it's listed on our website.
Okay, go to the website, ISOC-DC.org. Sorry about that, David. Okay. Anyway, I work for Microsoft. We hosted the last Internet Society chapter event at our facility. Very interesting discussions on internet governance and the like. Also, we have a couple of former board members of the Internet Society here. Hands up. Right there. Steve Crocker and Vinny, who's not listening to me. So you can talk to them about global Internet Society if you're not aware on what all the good things we're doing. So let me now turn it over to our moderator, David McCauley, who used to work for the Internet Society and now works for one of the companies I used to work for, which is Bloomberg. David is writing for Bloomberg BNA and does some of the most in-depth and detailed and impartial reporting about the domain name field of anybody I know, and I think will be an exceptional moderator for this panel. So over to you, David.
Thank you, Mike and Liz. Thanks very much. Welcome to the event today, and thank you to the sponsors for putting this on. It's going to be very instructive. We are going to have some panel presentations, and the way it's going to work is the first two speakers are going to speak basically from where I'm speaking, down here on the floor, and Dr. Kaliski is going to use some slides. We'll lower the screen down. Following the first two speakers, the next three speakers, we will go up and take our place up on the stage, and they'll speak from there. And what I'll do in just a second is introduce the first two speakers who are going to speak this morning, and then after they speak and we take our seats, I will introduce the following three speakers. The format is to be brief presentations from each of the speakers. We're talking something on the order of 5 to 10, 11, 12 minutes, something like that. And it's going to be something where I'll try and make sure we stay on time. I'm sorry, I'll try and make sure that we stay on time, but there'll be brief presentations. Our first speaker is going to be Taylor Frank, and I've actually given him a couple more minutes because one of the things we want to do is what the IETF and what ICANN do so well is they have newcomer sessions. And so Taylor has agreed to give a general overview of the gTLD program for people that may be new to this here in this room or on the webcast. And so that'll be 1 or 2 minutes extra that he's going to take. So bear with us while we do that. It's a very good thing to do to make sure that people can understand what's going on, a little bit of a roadmap, if you will. After the presentations, I will be asking the speakers a number of questions, but I'll also be tuned to the room to see if there are people out here that have interesting questions that they would like to bring up, and we'll certainly make that as accommodating as we can. And Liz and David may also ask some questions. Finally, I would just like to say thank you, and let me just jump into the introductions. Our first speaker this morning will be Taylor Frank, who's the Vice President of Strategy and Development at FairWinds Partners, one of our sponsors today. Taylor specializes in advising brand owners on ways to optimize digital presence, and he's presently advising dozens of corporations who are involved in the new gTLD program. Following Taylor, Dr. Bert Kaliski, Jr., Senior Vice President and Chief Technology Officer at VeriSign will speak. Dr. Kaliski leads the VeriSign labs, and he facilitates the technical community within the VeriSign corporate family. With that done, I will now turn it over to Taylor. Both microphones.
One hand, two hands. Thanks, David. As David mentioned, I'm Taylor Frank, a vice president with FairWinds, and these aren't my slides, but I think these are your slides, but I'm going to talk a few minutes just about the new gTLD program in general, just to give people who aren't familiar with the space some context, some background, so this is a meaningful and productive conversation. And then also, as David mentioned, I'll share our perspective on the new gTLD topic. And FairWinds is a strategy consultancy that works nearly exclusively with brand owners. So we can share the brand perspective on new TLDs from a number of different angles. So first, a bit of background. And again, apologies if this is repetitive for nearly everyone in the room, but new gTLDs are probably a fairly foreign topic to everybody outside of this room. Here on the street, pretty much everywhere. So we're just now beginning the process of educating the general public, educating consumers, etc. People are now seeing advertisements on TV during sporting events about new gTLDs. Still don't know what it means, but they're starting to get this, and we're just starting to see the education process get up and running. So I think we're holding an event in February, a few blocks away at the museum, to talk about new gTLDs, to start spreading awareness, etc. But for those who aren't aware, we're going to give a little bit of background on new gTLDs, and to understand new gTLDs, it's best to start with the basics of what's a TLD. TLD stands for top-level domain. So for example, Bloomberg.com. .com is the TLD within that web address or within that domain name. There are a couple of different kinds of TLDs. There are generic or gTLDs, things like .com or .net or .org or .gov. There are country code top-level domains, things like .uk for the United Kingdom, .de for Germany, .ca for Canada. There are also internationalized domain names, so domain names where to the right of the dot is in foreign script, and then there are infrastructural domains like .arpa, which, again, nearly everyone outside of this room probably doesn't know that exists, but they're definitely there. So that's a TLD. There are about 20 gTLDs, a couple hundred ccTLDs, and a number of others. Now, from what's a TLD to the new gTLD program, it's important to understand the organization behind the entire space. So ICANN, the Internet Corporation of Assigned Names and Numbers, is a nonprofit that was created in 1998, essentially by the Department of Commerce. And their goal or their purpose, their mission, is to develop policy and to not necessarily regulate, but to act as the steward for the domain space. In 2008, I believe, ICANN began a policy development process that was supposed to ultimately lead to a new program that would introduce diversity to the domain space. Essentially, they wanted to open up the top-level space to .anything you wanted. So instead of .com or .net or .uk, you could apply for .mobile or .careers or .bloomberg. This policy development process began in 2008, I believe, and then concluded in 2011. When the program was finalized, it was approved. And the program itself began in 2012 for 4 months, between January and April in 2012. You could apply for .anything you want. You had to pay a bit of money, you had to submit a fairly lengthy application, you had to prove that you were a legitimate organization, you submit an application. Between then and now, we've been going through the review process where ICANN has reviewed all of the applications, they've vetted them, they've approved most of them, and we're just now at the point where the first TLDs are starting to launch. So publicly, the end of this month, January, February, the first new TLDs are going to be hitting the market. So that's kind of the new TLD program in a nutshell, and a few statistics. ICANN, I believe, expected at most about 500 applications last year. In the end, they received almost 2,000. So that in and of itself is one of the main reasons why we're probably having this event and why new TLDs, we're talking about what the impact of new TLDs is going to be on the internet. If it was 100 applications or 200 applications, there would certainly be a little bit more skepticism around how much impact or how meaningful could they really be at the end of the day. But when there were 2,000 total applications, about 1,400 unique strings, we're talking about hundreds of global brands that have applied. We're talking about a very, very large space that has the momentum to lead to some significant change and to lead to some impact, some competition, et cetera. So from a high level, it's a big deal. There are a lot of applications, and the first new TLDs are starting to launch right now. From a FairWinds perspective, again, we work with brands. So we work with approximately 100 corporations in the United States, in Europe, in Latin America, some domestic, some are global brands. So from our perspective, we're able to share anecdotally what companies are thinking about new TLDs and what their philosophy is around how meaningful they're going to be, what kind of impact they're going to have on the internet, et cetera. So on behalf of our clients and companies in general, they're kind of two parallel perspectives where if I'm a Bloomberg or if I'm a Nike or if I'm Symantec or if I'm a company, companies that we work with, we view essentially the new TLD program as two kind of halves of a pie. There are, I'll explain the lingo in a second, open new gTLDs and closed new gTLDs. Open refers to a new TLD that anybody can register in. So similar model to .com or .net. It's open to the general public. The purpose is to allow people to register and use domain names. Anyone in the general public can basically use it. Those are open TLDs. There are also closed TLDs, meaning a .gov or a .edu within the current space, they're closed to a specific set of registrants. Most of the brands that have applied for new TLDs, like .Nike or .Bloomberg, those are closed TLDs. So those are kind of the two halves of the pie. And from a corporate perspective, we basically are viewing those two separate halves individually. So the open new TLDs, we talk about that being the external space. So again, I'm just going to use Bloomberg as an example. They view, or companies in general view, open new TLDs completely different than closed TLDs or brand TLDs. This external space, when we're talking about 2010, 2011, 2012, and even today, from a corporate perspective, there is very little, or there is some, but there is little enthusiasm around what these open new gTLDs could essentially bring from a corporate perspective. Sure, there's some value in having a .blog or .app or .nyc, but most corporations view this as an unnecessary thing that they didn't want, and they're going to have to pay to protect their intellectual property in those spaces. So from an external perspective, there's definitely some optimism, but generally speaking, most corporates that we're talking to, they see less opportunity and more risk when it comes to these open new TLDs. The most common argument we get is, why do we need 500 new .mobis, .museums, .travels? It's not the same, and we've led them or helped them understand why it isn't the same, but still, that's how a lot of companies are feeling. They feel like they've been pushed into this, and they're not necessarily that enthusiastic about it. The other half of the pie we refer to as internal planning, or from a brand perspective, a .brand perspective, it originated as the same way. So hundreds of the world's leading brands applied for TLDs, yes. But a lot of them did so defensively. Not necessarily, if I'm Bloomberg, I wasn't worried about somebody else applying for .Bloomberg because I have plenty strong intellectual property rights to Bloomberg as a trademark. It was more, well, what happens if we see a .WSJ or Wall Street Journal or a .New York Times or something like this? We don't want to be boxed out for an indefinite period of time. We're not sure if it's going to be 4 years, 5 years before we can apply again. That was the general theme across most corporations that applied for new TLDs. Sure, some were more aggressive. Google applied for 100, Amazon applied for 76. Those were probably not defensive plays necessarily, but most corporates, most of our clients, it was fairly defensive at first. Over the last 2 years, that has gone from, for the most part, purely defensive to not necessarily full-out offensive, but definitely there's a much higher level of enthusiasm and optimism around what a .Google or what a .Bloomberg or what a .Nike can bring to the internet. Once people saw that there were 2,000 applications, once people saw that Google applied and Amazon applied and a number of different, hundreds of global brands applied, people became invested and the money had been spent. They started to involve creative departments, digital departments, marketing departments, going through the process of working with these strategic companies around how can we use a .Cisco or how can we use a .Google. Again, we've gone from defensive to a much more optimistic viewpoint where a decent number of our clients want to get out there and use their .brands as quickly as possible. A majority, they want to get out there and they want to use them quickly, not so aggressive, but still there's a general enthusiasm when it comes to the .brand, the closed, the safe, the trusted spaces. So from a corporate perspective or a high level, that's anecdotally where our clients and companies in general fall, at least the people we talk with. The open TLD space, there's risk there, and companies are going to have to spend to protect themselves. The .brand space or the closed space, that's where we think a decent amount of the innovation and the change and the potential new models, that's where we see that coming from. So that's, I think, where the excitement for us lies.
Thanks very much. Dr. Kaliski? I'll hold this for you. Or can you do both?
I got it.
Okay.
Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. And good setting the stage for an important transformation in the way that we all interact with the internet. Everything has a name from one point of view or another. How do we use those names and find the things that we're looking for? An interesting technical topic that I wanted to set the stage for is something called name collisions. And what I hope to achieve in the next 10 minutes or so is to give you a good definition and progress report on the problem of name collisions to help you understand perhaps the primary issue that the technical community is working through in support of the business objectives for this new gTLD program. Next slide. So we start with the story of installed systems on the internet on the left-hand side interacting with the global domain name system, or DNS. Installed systems make a number of assumptions about how they can name things. And the domain name system is now 30 years old. Within any system, you will have names that you use for internal purposes and names that you use for external purposes. Over time, a community develops expectations for which things would be internal and which things would be external. As Taylor said, there are on the order of several hundred top-level domains that are associated with countries. There are on the order of about 20 or so generic top-level domains that are associated with general-purpose uses, and these have been in the mindset of the internet community as it's developed systems, which means that the internet community has often chosen names that are not on that list for its internal networks. For example, within a corporation, devices might be on a network that has a name that ends in .corp or .local or .home, but there are many other things. Now, the process of resolving a name, that is, translating the name into an IP address or other record, generally at some point involves contacting the global DNS. So I've shown on the upper part of this diagram a message going from an installed system to the global DNS that includes a second-level domain, SLD, and a top-level domain, TLD, and the dots between them, something.sld.tld. And if that TLD exists only in the local namespace of the installed system, then the response that comes back from the global DNS is that the top-level domain doesn't exist. It's NX domain. In fact, that's a general purpose response when the query that's sent to the global DNS ultimately produces an error message indicating that the name hasn't been registered externally. That's what internal systems have been expecting as they've been designed for many of these top-level domains. Next slide. Now, suppose, on the other hand, that the top-level domain that has been assumed not to be registered externally suddenly is registered externally. And as I note on the right-hand side, with that top-level domain added to the global DNS, there are now 1,400 more potential opportunities. All of the applicants for all the good purposes that have proposed these additions to the domain name system have a potential impact on the installed systems that may have assumed, based on best practices for 20 years or so, that these names were reserved. And the installed system then has what we'll call a name collision. In fact, another term for this would be a namespace collision. The assumptions that the internal namespace and the external namespace were separate from each other has been broken. And therefore, the internal namespace must deal with the consequences of the external namespace providing not the error message NX domain, but an actual resource record. In other words, an indication that this is where the name should map to. Now, if that were to happen, there are several potential risks. One is that the installed system breaks. It's expecting to contact the printer on the 8th floor, and instead it contacts a server across the world because the resource record points it to an internet address somewhere else. Internal information might leak because now queries that at one time were only being sent to the root servers of the domain name system are now propagating to other parts unexpectedly, unknown to the internal system when it was originating its queries. And then worse yet, there could be some cyber attacks. Now, this might seem extreme, and it's certainly not the case that every time a collision occurs, all of these consequences follow. These are the potential risks. These are the kinds of things that security researchers look at carefully to understand the bounds of the risk and then make the right risk-benefit trade-offs. But the important point is that assumptions have changed. The assumption that internal stays internal and external stays external has changed. And there's an interesting reason for that, which we might get into later on. For convenience purposes, the best practice for resolving names on the internet is not to make an initial requirement that you distinguish between internal and external names. Think of that carefully next time you make an international call on your cell phone. You always start your international call with some international prefix, a plus, a 011, or in other countries, their own prefixes. You're never concerned that when you're dialing a number, it might sometimes be in your country and sometimes outside your country. But with the way that domain names have been set up and established practice for 2 decades, the queries all start the same. Technically, you could distinguish by putting a dot at the end to say this only should be resolved externally. And some of you who are more into the technical details of DNS know where I'm getting. To use the Bloomberg.com example aforementioned, the fully qualified distinguished name for Bloomberg.com is Bloomberg.com dot. That says it's global, but no one puts the dot at the end. So since our practice as an industry, as users, has not been to put dots at the end, when an internal system sees Bloomberg.com, it has to resolve the ambiguity. Should I put a dot at the end, or should I look internally? Now, Bloomberg.com system administrators, of course, know that they shouldn't name anything internal with a .com at the end, because that's external. But what if they named it something else at the end, assuming it's external, but the situation changes in the future? Next slide. So there are 3 general ways to address situations like this. This is active work taking place in the domain name industry, which is why it's important to keep track of what kinds of things are changing. Back, please. So number 1, you could change the installed systems so that they avoid using names that subsequently would be delegated externally. And if you imagine the process of upgrading anything on internet scale, that can be somewhat challenging. Second, you could constrain the global domain name system. Just not make any changes to it. Minimize the changes. Third, some hybrid of both. And this is the usual dilemma of introducing any new technology. It changes assumptions you've already been making. How do you do that successfully? Next slide. One of the proposals is to make an assumption. If we knew about how all the internal systems, all the installed systems use the global DNS, and if we knew all the queries that they might make, and if we knew all the second-level domains that they might use in those queries, well, then we could find a way of minimizing the harm just by not using those second-level domains. Let's see if that's possible. I'll show you some graphs illustrating the challenge. Next slide. So without getting into too much detail, notice the red line through the middle. This is taken from actual experimental data over the last 8 years, counting queries to the global root for new top-level domains that might be delegated at some point in the future. And the red line says how many new second-level domains are seen every year. That's moving up and to the right, which means at any given point in time, there are always new second-level domains that have never been seen before coming out of these installed systems. So if hypothetically you wanted to take a point in time and say, let's not use all these second-level domains, because they might interfere with what's taking place in installed systems, the next year you'd have even more of them to add to your list. It's a moving target. Next slide. This shows somewhat of a before and after simulation. Even if you took one of those lists, at how the number of queries that are potentially at risk would be reduced. So top line in these is in red. That is a measure of how many queries potentially at risk from installed systems were seen at the global route at a certain observation period, actually a recent 3-month window. The bottom line, the blue, shows how many of those queries would still have been made if a designated